Cool. Okay. So thank you, everyone, for who's here for showing up on time. Thank you, everyone who has a camera on for having your camera on. Um, let's do this. Let's whoever is in need of a camera, uh, please send me a private chat message in Zoom, and we'll work together to get DTS to deliver on the promise of equal access to education. And we'll take it up the chain of command to the vice presidents and to the president as far as we need to make good on Wentworth's promise for equal access to all, which is, of course, the reason why we love the laptop program, currently under consideration for elimination as a budget saving measure. So, and if you have started the ball rolling with DTS, please share that information with me as well. Like, what is DTS telling each of us when we ask for help with our camera technology? We're up to 30, so I'll save the participation message. Analysis, there's friends don't let friends continue to get B minus, or even B plus scores on this analysis assignment. We fully expect each and every one of you to get an A on this assignment. And we expect that if you're paying attention and taking advantage of the resources and talking to your classmates who seem to know what the secret of success is in this assignment, and thus your careers, we expect everyone who cares enough to try to be able to get an A sooner rather than later. So if you're frustrated about your grading, let us know. Let me know. I will, the resources are there, the instructions, the example, the help videos that are linked in Brightspace that takes us through step by step. It's a 60-minute video, step by step. How do you get 30 points out of 30 possible points? You can do it. And your friends can do it, so please help them out. The chat, I'm going to open up the chat window and do my best to monitor what you are saying is the most important takeaway from the reading, and what a reading that was. What are the most urgent questions that come out of the reading, come out of last week's forum experience, and come up during the lecture? And we do expect each and every one of you to be contributing a minimum of 3 somethings: questions, comments, responses to your classmates. This is a graded exercise. Are we up to enough people to talk about grades at all? No, let's wait. We're still at 31 out of 46, so not yet a quorum. And midterm grades will be coming out. Even though we only have 32, maybe I'll say it now because I don't want to interrupt the lecture once there's more people here. Please let your classmates know. Friends don't let friends underperform when the secret of success is so easily in hand. So please spread the word. Let your colleagues know. Attendance is part of the evaluation of your performance in this course. Your contribution to chat questions is graded. The performance in the forum on Wednesday. That's a group assignment that is graded. Uh, if you are logged into Zoom for less than, if, for not even close to 2 hours, you're at risk of getting 0 points. You have to attend a significant majority of the course lecture and the Wednesday forums to get credit for being here. This is part of your performance evaluation. And at a certain point, when we can get sorted through this camera thing, the camera is a factor as well. Having your camera on, participating. When we ask a question, we look over and we see your response. We see thumbs up, thumbs down. We see laughter, acknowledgement, yes and no, nodding head, shaking head. These are all part of the bandwidth that is part of the give and take of the course. So all of this matters. Midterm grades are coming out next week before we have a chance to meet on Wednesday. Um, Friends don't let friends underperform in a course when it's so easy to do well. There's a rumor that I hear over and over again that once you get into Wentworth, there's no way to get out. Let me reassure you all, who, especially those of you who are doing hard work and doing such a good job at taking advantage of these opportunities to learn, that that's not true. It is hard to get through Wentworth. Students fail all the time. Students leave the program every semester. Um, they, how do you get an F in the, how do you fail this course? Here's one way. Fail to turn in a minimum of 2/3 of the assignments. Fail to turn in every element of the term project that we'll be talking about soon. Fail to attend a minimum of 2/3 of the course, and that's how most students fail this course. And we've had students repeat this course 2, 3, 4 times. I'm embarrassed to say. So yes, it's not a done deal. Not everyone succeeds in this course. There are minimum standards. If you have questions about that, you can put it in the chat. Um,
I actually have a question.
yes, Denalia.
Hi. So I'm only able to see the first two grades, and I don't know why. I'm not sure if that's for everyone, but
Yeah, I'm only
There
seeing
is a
the first two grades.
malfunction. Is that true, Ryan?
Yeah, I got the same issue.
So there is something that's a user problem that Manuel and I are not quite up on the Brightspace thing. For some assignments, it gives you a B. For other assignments, it gives you 15 out of 30. Um, and I'm not, I'm going to have to figure that out. And I'm not sure what it's going to take to change that. But if you're urgently, you can always look at your feedback and you can see the score that you're getting on all. Can you, so Denalia and Ryan, can you see do you have access to the feedback grid, the criteria in all of them? No, Denalia, you don't. So who wants
um,
to work? Can you work with me after class to try to figure out your side of the experience because I don't have access to your view.
sure.
Thank you so much. So
Um,
that's important. Anything else we should talk about
for,
before we jump in?
for me, I can see I can see my grades if I go to where I actually submitted it and go down, it will tell you at the bottom,
Mm-hmm.
but it doesn't say it in the grade section like you guys said. I can only see the first two too, but if I go to the actual submission for like 9, say, I can see the grade there.
That is so interesting. Can you help us figure this out after class?
Sure.
Thank you, Kiara.
I figured it out.
You figured it out?
Yeah, all you have to do is go to class progress in the drop down for grading in progress, and then scroll down to assignments, and you could see every assignment and the grade you get.
Yeah, what he said. Like literally.
Okay. If anyone is still, I'll try that out after class. If anyone is struggling with that, please stay on the Zoom call after class, and we will figure it out. I want every single person in the course to have equal access to the feedback and the grades and all of that. So let's commit to doing that together. Friends don't let friends proceed without access to the grades. Manuel, anything else?
No, I think it's that is the important part, that everybody has to be agree that equal opportunity, equal access to everyone is important.
Yes, Wentworth is committed to that, and we're going to help Wentworth fulfill that promise as much as possible. Okay, so I am attempting to share my screen at this moment. I'm looking for acknowledgement. It's working. Thank you, Lily. So here we go. Automobility. When I first started teaching, I was asked to teach a course that would help. I was teaching at RISD at the time, and I was asked to teach a course that would help students enter into the world where it's very clear that our understanding of the world is the product of the lenses that are produced from the day we're born till the day we die. We see the world through a set of values that we inherit from our parents, from our friends, our family, the structures of the world, including the built environment. So as architects, it's really important to understand how the built environment is integrated with cultural mindsets, cultural structures, social structures that are produced and reproduced generation after generation. And these social structures manifest as certain mindsets that we inherit, especially in North American culture, in the United States. And we see the world not in a neutral manner, but we see the world from a very specific position. We see the world and understand the world through these filters that are our own biases, our own prejudices, the things that we inherit, that we develop as we come into the world and develop as human beings. How many of you went to high school? It's kind of a trick question. Everyone went to high school. I just want to make sure your hand works. Thank you. Now, how many of you have access to your own car? Okay. And in your vision of your life 10 years from now, picture you're very successful architect, your student loans are almost paid off, maybe you're buying a house. Do you own a car? Yes or no? Okay. So this ties in with, you'll already recognize how these questions and this lecture and this framing ties in very intimately with what we talked about last week. Prejudices, biases that we inherit from our world that are produced in part by the built environments that we occupy and that we develop in. So this is a big topic. And when I was asked to teach this course at RISD, I said, well, all of these students that are coming through architecture schools, they all have a very strong opinion about cars because who doesn't? We're Americans, most of us. And uh, we have a license to hold a very strong opinion. It's almost as if a driver's license gives every American uh, uh, the credentials to critique the automobile system. And to demand free parking as a human right. And so um, we we all grow up in a very strongly positioned viewpoint. And so we tackled this topic of automobility, and it took an entire semester to cover what we're going to cover very quickly. Um, and so we're going to look back at the history, and we're going to try to make connections, multiple connections to the topics we've covered, especially the topic last week of the LA School of redlining. We're also going to make connections forward in the course, back in history, and we're going to make connections. We're going to cover a lot of territory in this lecture that will be familiar to us from last summer in the History Theory 2 course. And I'm so grateful that we've been able to kind of enrich and deepen the History Theory 2 course curriculum over the last few years so that it weaves very closely together to allow us to circle back to those histories. So here we go. We here in the Boston metropolitan region live in a built environment that is the result of the streetcar suburb. And it's a recognizable formula. Uh, it looks something like this. Bear in mind, this is not a good example of an analysis. It uses a solid red line. That's not what we want. It uses an abstract stripe in yellow. It's not transparent enough. The green might be transparent enough, but it's not specific enough. So please don't use this as an example. But this, the underlying image is still, to the extent that the underlying image is visible, you recognize this pattern. You have a main street with 2 or 3 story businesses on it, retail on the bottom floor, and then you have cross streets that create these long residential blocks with triple deckers or multi-family dwellings or single family dwellings. In the Boston area, we tend to have triple deckers. And this is the streetcar suburb, famously presented to us, theorized, and exemplified by Sam Bass Warner, one of our neighbors here in Boston, who wrote the book, Streetcar Suburbs, about Boston. A big part of this lecture is very near and dear and close to home. It's Boston. Boston is all around us on the campus, and it's a very vivid demonstration of a lot of the things we're talking about. And the streetcar suburb is an example on a different scale of what we understand as a corridor, an infrastructure corridor. And going further back in history, one of the things we see in our histories is the corridor structure of the United States rail system. That the rail system was a land development strategy where the U.S. rail system was funded by selling off parcels in 50-mile stretches, a 100-mile wide corridor. I'm not sure I'm getting that dimension right. Maybe it's much less than 100 miles. But the theory is this, that the second you create a transportation corridor, the second you produce in the infrastructure to connect people to markets, to urban centers, you are increasing the value of that land. So that increase in value of the land was used as a perpetual motion machine by 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 promising before they laid a single segment of rail, the rail company said, we are going to build a rail line across the country here. And that rail line is going to create valuable land on either side of those rail lines. Who wants to buy those parcels? And so the rail companies were given the land for free. It cost a lot to wage wars against the indigenous populations on those land. It was a very expensive proposition to colonize the middle of the United States. But then, in the name of development, the U.S. government justified it as this giant money generating machine as part of the larger extractive colonial project that you know all about from last summer. And so simply the promise, and this is a lot like Dubai, the promise of future value, that the promise of constructing a rail line was enough to increase the value of the land. The land sales produced the money in order to finance the rail system. And off we go. And then the tax revenues from all of that increase in value, the US government is able to recoup its investment through all those, the bloody genocidal campaigns. So, and we're going to get into this a bit more in the grids. So the streetcar suburb was a similar operation at a smaller scale. The formula went something like this: purchase of land for $1, agricultural value of the land, purchase the land for $1, then invest in building a streetcar line on a road that leads from that agricultural land to the city center. It costs money to build mass transit, doesn't it? It costs a lot of money. We don't like to do that here in the United States. It's a big investment. It's very expensive. But when you're starting with agricultural land, you don't have the land cost. You have a very low land cost to build infrastructure. And if you are a real estate developer, you're buying the land for $1. And once you build a road that connects to the city center and put a streetcar down the middle of it, which might cost you $5 per parcel to build that streetcar. By the time you do that, by the time you build the road and the streetcar line, and lay out the parcels and supply water, etc., the infrastructure, build the street grids, that's a big investment. It costs like $30 per parcel. But you have just increased the value of that parcel. You bought the land for $1, you invested another $30 to create all the infrastructure, but you're selling it for $100. Thank you very much. So, and you're building a house on it, maybe you're up to $70. So you are recouping a significant return on your investment only because there is a streetcar line. Until there's a streetcar line connecting this new neighborhood to the city center, the value of that parcel remains at $1. But as soon as it's connected to the city center, $100. And so that Main Street pattern shows up in every significant town and city in the United States between the 1980s and 1930. And in that 50-year period, every city in the United States and very quickly after that, every city in the world develops a garden city suburb strategy, either based on a streetcar system or some other similar infrastructure pattern. And so you will see this pattern in Boston, in this example, St. Paul and Minneapolis, Minnesota. You see it in New York. You see it in every city throughout the United States and the world. And that includes Los Angeles. Here we are back in Los Angeles. There were some questions remaining from the discussion last week about Los Angeles. We're trying to respond to how Los Angeles happened. How did this complex polynucleic thing that we call Los Angeles. How did Los Angeles happen? Well, here's how it happened. Um, if you're a fan of new age music from the 1980s, and maybe your parents um, got you into it, there was a famous song, "Nobody Walks in L.A." and that was just a truism. Everyone knows nobody walks in L.A. If you live in L.A., you drive a car because there's no transit system. That is what we used to say. LA has, in the past 30 years, spent a huge investment in building a subway system and building a light rail system and introducing bike lanes. People are bicycling all over LA. Maybe I could live there again. Um, it's really a remarkable transformation, but it is so expensive to build light rail and heavy rail lines that the bus riders of LA sued the city of LA to force them to stop investing in rail lines. It's too expensive. Um, and everyone knows that LA has this history of being a city of automobiles, nothing but automobiles. But wait, uh, go back to the 1920s. What city has the most extensive mass transit system in the world? Yes, Los Angeles. And it's really not the city of Los Angeles, it's the greater metropolitan region, the greater metropolitan statistical area, to use the technical term, of Los Angeles, of Southern California, was the most extensive mass transit system in the world in the 1920s. And it is completely the product of this system of streetcar rail development that we see right here. And so the neighborhoods of LA were produced from the streetcar system. And we saw it in the land value diagrams from the Chicago school moving towards the LA school. The Chicago school is the concentric zone theory. The LA school is the multiple nuclei theory. And in between those two things, we have the sector theory. The sector theory is that as infrastructure, as transportation infrastructure is built, it produces exceptional segments of development. It increases the value of the land around it. So much so that the linkage between, and if you look at I think you see me in the upper corner. The hand gesture is crucial visual here. The linkage between land use and transportation was the secret of financing the most sophisticated transportation systems in history. The transportation infrastructure investment increases the land value by many times greater than the cost of the infrastructure. So it's natural. If you want to finance mass transit, capture the increase in land value. Simple, right? It's so simple that every transportation system in history has been financed and paid for by the increase in land value until World War II, when the United States took the lead in saying, no, we're going to disconnect the increase in land value from transportation costs. We're going to force the federal government to just throw money, or the local government to throw money into transportation. And if they want to earn that money back, they got to raise their fares. And yes, it increases the land values all around it, but we're going to make it extremely difficult. It's not impossible. There are development fee schemes, and there are other taxation schemes that attempt to recoup the increase in land value produced, as we see in the sector theory here. But the United States is alone in the world, or was alone in the world, in decoupling those two things. And the solution moving forward is to recouple those things. If you want to finance mass transit investment in Los Angeles, capture the increase in land value. And that's something, capture the increase in land value produced by that infrastructure development. So that's a present from us to you. Take this forward into your careers. When you are before the public meeting promoting the importance of mass transit in your community or the communities where you are working, feel free to mention that every dollar of investment in mass transportation systems is returned in the increase in value 10, 100-fold. And it's if you want to finance, if you want to justify the investment, you don't have to just do a bond issue or raise a sales tax. You have the option of doing what every other society in the world continues to do, and the United States did up until World War II. You can just capture that value. And we're going to look at the history of how this disconnect occurred. And if this sounds like a conspiracy, it turns out it was a conspiracy. It was very much subject to legal action. It was taken to court. The companies that were found guilty and fined for their collaborations to destroy mass transit in cities throughout the United States. If you're familiar with this movie, and I'm looking for acknowledgement, you know this movie? Yeah. It's a cartoon. It's so cartoonish. There's an evil villain in it, and it's ridiculous. You know, it doesn't take itself seriously. Who would believe that this cartoonish villain would buy a streetcar system only to dismantle it? That's crazy. You know, it's such an unbelievable plot. And yet that's exactly what the history is.
Everyone except for the 1 in 10 who owned an automobile used rail.
Can you hear this?
At that time, Alfred P. Sloan said, wait a minute, this is a great opportunity. I mean, we've got 90% of the market out there that we can somehow turn into automobile users. If we can eliminate the rail alternatives, we will create a new market for our cars. And if we don't, then this whole, you know, the entire General Motors sales are just going to be lovely. They had to get rid of the streetcars. They wanted the space that the streetcars used for automobiles.
And they wanted people to buy cars. So what do?
They had to find something they could put in place of the streetcar. Sloan had the concept that he wanted to somehow motorize all the major cities of the country. That meant replacing all the street railways with buses. And ultimately thinking that no one would want to ride the buses, and therefore they'd buy General Motors automobiles. Sloan wanted to get in very big in this field. What he bought was phenomenal. The largest bus operating company in the country and the largest bus production company. And using that as a foothold, GM moved into Manhattan. They acquired interest in the New York railways, and between 1926 and 36, they methodically destroyed the rails. When they finally motorized New York, General Motors issued these ads throughout the country, and this is important because they're trying to show that motorization is the wave of the future. They issued these ads, and it said, the motorization of 4th and Madison is the most important and epical event in the history of community transportation.
In the mid-1930s, GM worked hard to create the impression of a nationwide trend away from rail. But there was no trend. Buses were a tough sell. They jolted, they smelled, they inched through traffic. City by city, it took the hidden hand of General Motors to replace streetcars with yellow coach buses. In 1936, a company was founded that would grow to dominate American city transportation. National City Lines had no visible connection to General Motors. In fact, the director of operations came from a GM subsidiary, Yellow Coach, and members of the board came from Greyhound, which was founded and controlled by General Motors. The money to start this new company also came from Greyhound and Yellow Coach. To hide these connections, the company needed a front man. Roy Fitzgerald got his start in northern Minnesota, where he hauled miners and school children in a couple of buses. General Motors would groom him to become president of National City Lines. Over the next few years, Standard Oil of California, Mack Truck, Phillips Petroleum, and Firestone Tire would join GM in backing this venture.
All of a sudden, you get these fellows with the fedora hats, the spats. I'm not making that up. The two-tone shoes, the broad ties, the black shirts, the white Panamas. All of a sudden, they show up. And, of course, the word goes out, hey, we're being bought.
Fitzgerald, big name in buses. National City now in top place as operator of city route miles. Prime mover is E. Roy Fitzgerald, who describes himself as one of 5 farm boys trying to run a few buses.
The Fitzgeralds came in here just like they did in every city they ever went into. They destroyed an established public transit system that had been built to meet the needs of the people.
So the streetcars, we love riding on them. And it was fun because they were big, there was plenty of room and all that.
We'd catch them at the same time every day. We'd know the conductor, and you'd meet people that you'd see every day. And you weren't afraid to talk to someone.
The streetcar was fast. It just jumped on chairs like that. It was so fast. And then the conductor, every time he would come to a crossing, he'd go clink, 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 clink.
To the trolley cars yourself?
Oh, yeah, J-car, yeah. I was there.
They were around when we were younger.
That was the best form of transportation. Then somebody had the bright idea to take up all the track and get rid of all the trolleys. That's when the headache started.
So the strategy was to have National City Lines purchase the municipal streetcars. First, each streetcar company was associated with a specific real estate development corridor. And cities found that to be intolerably inefficient. So cities in the early 20th century purchased these private streetcar lines, consolidated them, including in New York City, the great consolidation of each independent subway system. And so that the city became the operator of these streetcar lines. And this was the first disconnect between land use and transportation in terms of finance. And cities struggled to manage these systems, but they justified it because it was the basis for economic development. The connectivity between where people lived and where people worked was the core, was the essence, was the prerequisite for economic development. As soon as you have difficulty getting around the city, your economic development suffers, and companies and businesses move out and people move out. And so the mobility of a population in a metropolitan area is a fundamental prerequisite to the economic, social, and cultural health of a city. And so, with these cities consolidating these different streetcar lines, struggling to keep it going, the National City Lines team would fly in their plane, and they did this in 83 cities in the United States, every major city. They would purchase, including Boston, they would purchase the streetcar lines from the city. They would wait 90 days, and then they would take the streetcars off the rails, put them in a lot, and they would spend a lot of money doing this. And they would even invest the money to remove the rails out of the street. If you want to know what happened to Nubian Square, Nubian Square was once the second biggest economic hub. It was a rival downtown to downtown Boston, and it was connected by light rail. Well, that light rail was decommissioned. The rails were removed from Washington Street, and we're going to get to that.
I could see what was happening. They did it in Baltimore. They did it in Philadelphia. They did it in Los Angeles. Come in to do a job. And 5 gallons of kerosene went with every trolley car. Put a torch to it, and that's the way it went. Now, you stripped everything. They don't have to stay. Once they sell you buses, it'll perpetuate itself.
And the scheme was to reduce...
The suburbs wouldn't exist if it weren't for cheap oil. The U.S. is a car culture. The automobile industry started in the U.S., and really the automobile industry got its start here because we were looking for ways to use that cheap oil. The U.S. was awash in oil in the early 20th century. In the 1930s, they were discovering the stuff so fast that oil in Texas was cheaper than drinking water by the carload. The car companies quickly became the engine driving U.S. industry and economic growth. The result of this is that we have created this new system of habitation where people live miles and miles from where they work and from where they get their food and all of their other necessities, based on the idea that they can and they must hop in their car at any moment and travel miles and miles. And the only way that works is on the basis of cheap energy.
Now we're stuck up a cul-de-sac in a cement SUV with an empty gas tank.
So the reading is really wonderful in its ability to explicitly say, and very point blank, automobility is not about the automobile. It's not just about the automobile. When is a car more than just a car? And a car is more than just a car when it has a ripple effect of transforming an entire economic, cultural, social system, which is what it did. And a car is more than just a car when those transformations change the very structure of our neural networks in our brains collectively. We understand the world through the filters of the assumptions of the automobile system. And so this larger system is the biggest single transformation in architecture in the 20th century. And we saw this So I'm going to very quickly review what we looked at in last summer in the History 2 course, making the distinction between Taylorism, which is this scientific study of human motion and to create efficiencies that were at the core of mass production, of the assembly line. This is a distinct innovation of the scientific industrial revolution to increase greater efficiency. Fordism is a different thing. Fordism is a combination of Taylorism, the efficiencies, the scientific study of human motion, the efficiencies of the assembly line to produce mass production. But instead of just making it cheaper and more efficient to produce automobiles, Henry Ford did something radical that is not talked about a lot. He broke with his industrial class and he had this wild idea. He said, instead of paying our workers $1 a day, let's pay our workers $3 a day. It's the equivalent today of taking the minimum wage, the national federal minimum wage, from $7.25, not just to $15 an hour, which is one of the proposals before Congress right now, but let's take it up to $30 an hour or $25 an hour, a tripling of the wage. What that does, both when Henry Ford did it in the teens and what Congress is looking at today, is, and we've mentioned this before, you could give a millionaire $1 million and it will change hands once. It will go into some investment, he'll buy back stock, whatever, but it changes hands once and it shows up on the economic register as $1 million. Or you can give 1 million people $1 who need it, and they will spend that $1 and they will spend it on food, clothing, shelter, basic needs, healthcare, and that $1 will change hands maybe 1,000 times. So now your $1 million investment in people's basic needs has turned into $1 billion in the economy. So it had a 1,000-fold impact. That is the economic theory behind this increase of the minimum wage, and it worked. Back in when Henry Ford produced a mass consumption revolution by taking the bold step of paying the workers more than they had been paid. So suddenly he produced a working class capable of purchasing the cars that they themselves were making. That is Fordism. And the sudden boom in car ownership that resulted from all these different forces just fired up the minds of the architects. The architects just took off. Back 100 years ago, architects did not shy away from engaging in the design of the built environment, of landscapes, of urban design, of planning. And you see these bold transportation land use proposals by Edgar Chambliss in 1903. And under the influence of Chambliss's road town ideas, you see Corbusier 20 years later, 30 years later, exploring a lot of ideas about how infrastructure, road infrastructure, can transform architecture, the urban design, the built environment, the larger planning design of entire regions. And we're going to get into this. This is something we looked at last summer in History Theory 2, and we're going to drop a flag here. We're going to look at this more deeply next week. This is really the topic that we're going to dig into deeper next week, about the transformation of cities all over the world based on this vision that started with these ideas by Le Corbusier, codified and established in the 137 principles of the Athens Charter in 1933. And then that became a blueprint. In 1945, it was published by the International Congress of Modern Architecture, SIAM. It was published in the post-war period, where it became the blueprint for post-war reconstruction. And this is the fantasies, the visions of architects brought into easily digested and implemented form, so that the rebuilding of Europe after World War II had an easy blueprint, had a formula that it could follow. In the United States, where we were not bombed by Nazi Germany or Japan, thank you. But the destruction experienced by European cities was something we did to ourselves in the form of urban renewal, yes, driven in part by a combination of a vision of the importance of the automobile and the deep commitment to racial segregation in Jim Crow, building the Jim Crow United States, the white supremacy history of the United States. And we looked at this extensively, lots of video about Futurama.
Telephone.
So we don't need to go into this, but Norman Bell Geddes was commissioned by General Motors to design the Futurama exhibition of General Motors at the 1939 World's Fairs, envisioning the world of tomorrow, 1960.
A quarter of a mile high skyscrapers tower with convenient rest and recreational facilities for all. On many of the buildings are landing decks for helicopters and autogyros.
So none of this looks so radical to us because it was visualized and it was implemented very directly.
American cities have fundamentally altered how they built themselves over the last 60 years. And to me, the place that it really started was the 1939 World's Fair. At what was the most successful World's Fair in history, the most successful exhibit was one called Futurama.
To help us get a glimpse into the future of this unfinished world of ours, there has been created for the New York World's Fair a thought-provoking exhibit of the developments ahead of us, a vivid tribute to the American scheme of living. Come, let's travel into the future. What will we see?
Futurama portrayed the future of the city in that distant year 1960.
The world we are now seeing is a vision, an artistic conception which may undergo many changes as it develops into the great realities of tomorrow.
And it portrayed a city that was car-driven, lots of open spaces. You could live in the country and drive to your job downtown, and you'd have the best of two worlds.
Over space, man has begun to win victory.
Suburban splendor and urban excitement. Not coincidentally, Futurama was sponsored by General Motors, and they were promoting what we wanted. And it's my sense that 1939, just before the war, the clouds are looming over Europe. We go off to war, and we have this image that's mulling in our minds, and we come back and we implement Futurama.
15 million GIs came back from the war, clamoring for new homes and a piece of land in the country. Almost overnight, suburbia was born.
whole new idea about American communities. And my father was a part of that because he was a builder. And so in our area in Kansas City, Missouri, his employer, the J.C. Nichols Company, was finishing a home a day for years following the Second World War. And this was all about a new, hopeful American dream.
So the architects handed it off to planners. There was a split between architecture and planning. And architects suddenly, in the post-war period, were not dealing with the larger urban design of communities. Architects were more narrowly confined to buildings. And we are still struggling to overcome this handicap. It was a horrible mistake, and we're back. But it's a struggle, and not everyone agrees that architects should be involved in urban design. Urban design has shrunk to this tiny little profession of choosing street benches and paving patterns for sidewalks, when it should be expanding and growing and becoming an exploding realm of community design. And so the planners were very much developing according to this formula of the Athens Charter, of the Futurama vision, where the landscapes of North America and the communities of North America were very much the product of a transformation that was driven by literally the automobilization, the production of automobile dependence. Robert Moses was the most powerful non-elected figure in public life. He became the planner of New York City, the 5 boroughs, and then the Empire State. He was the empire builder of the Empire State of New York, and he cracked the puzzle. Yes, the open spaces of the United States can be transformed by the interstate highway system, which was justified as a way to mobilize the military in time of war. So with a military urgency, they built the interstate highway system across the United States. But what do you do when you get to cities? Robert Moses cracked that problem, and he said, I'll show you what we do when we get to cities. This is what we do. And we identify, and this is a connection to last week, you'll recognize this racial analysis of cities. You identify the undesirable neighborhoods, and you look for the adjacencies of desirable neighborhoods. And what you do is you draw a line between those two neighborhoods. And on the undesirable side of that line, you create a barrier. You bulldoze the houses and you build your freeway right through that edge so that you are protecting the desirable, which means white, single family housing, the most desirable neighborhood. And you create a barrier between that desirable land use and you reduce the size of the undesirable land use. The segregated communities of Harlem, of the Bronx, and throughout the New York metropolitan region. That was the formula that Robert Moses implemented, along with urban renewal. The other thing you do to these neighborhoods is you bulldoze them, displace all the people, and you build public housing, which often was, again, a deepening of the segregation of society. We talked about white flight. This image from Houston really is the clearest demonstration of the logics of the spatial arrangements of automobility. Cars are big. And so let's quickly go into, I'm going to present very quickly the critique. Like how do we as architects look at the history of cities and identify uh, and critique what is good and what is bad about our cities and what to do. So this is the critique. The analysis assignment is the way architects critique our built environments. And so here we go. We know that the built environment is a profound component of how we produce the relationship between structure and agency. This was the start of last week's lecture. The bad news is the design and construction of the built environment is profoundly implicated. It's not completely, it's not the whole story, but it is an essential instrument of producing the structures of oppression. If you've heard in the news the term systemic racism, this is what they're talking about. Systemic racism is a large construct, part of which is the formal spatial institutional arrangement that falls to architects, urban designers, and planners to produce, to reproduce. And the good news is we can break this cycle of reproduction because we have available to us a critical, the ability to critically understand the built environments that we inherit, the ability to identify through analysis what is causing the biggest harm, and thus what to do about it by changing the design of these neighborhoods. This is what your colleagues in the thesis program are doing every day, all day long. This is what architects do. This is what you will be called upon to do. This ties back with what we talked about last summer, that when we sit down to do an architectural project, we have a choice. We can simply reproduce what we have come to know, what we've been trained to do as competent professionals. Or we can understand the relationship between architectural design and larger systemic structures. And with that understanding, we can produce an architectural design that somehow offers an alternative to these systemic structures, like systemic racism, like systemic oppression, like misogyny, sexism, climate change, the climate emergency. We can identify the systemic structures that are producing harm through the design of the built environment, and we can do something about it. And yes, LEED and sustainable building practices is one thing. That's like saying, yeah, the Prius and electric cars are going to solve everything. Well, not exactly. It's not just the car and it's not just the building. It's the site planning of the building. It's the larger urban formal system, the formal spatial arrangements of our cities that produce these impacts of climate change. And on a good day, if you're designing as a method, as a way to change the systemic structures, you might have a shot on a good day of having an impact on larger cultures. And this is a reciprocal relationship. By understanding larger cultural forces, larger systems, we can then understand how those systems operate through the built environment and design our structure, our projects, design our architectures as an instrument for having impacts up this chain. This is what people do in our thesis program. It's a very strange thing that we just went through the admissions process in the MArch degree program, and I don't know, maybe people in the urbanism concentration are very satisfied with their educations thus far. But very few students from the urbanism program showed up, are showing up in the MArch program. If you can help me understand why that might be, I'd really appreciate it. So when does a project change and impact an entire system? And when does a system change impact an entire culture? And specifically automobile dependency. How do the formal, spatial, institutional arrangements of automobile dependency work, and how does automobile dependency reproduce itself? If we can understand the role of architecture in that reproduction, maybe we can break the cycle. So here we go. On the left, very, very direct relationship between the design of a building and the outcome on the built environment and global climate change. The size of a store with no parking, then in order to accommodate 11 cars, you reduce the size of the store by 50%. But 11 cars is not enough. There's a ratio of retail space to parking that is dictated by the zoning code. There's that damn zoning code again. Zoning code is one of the single most destructive forces ever unleashed upon the world. It's still with us. It makes it illegal to do anything but provide enormous parking lots for very relatively small retail spaces. And once you create big parking lots, you've effectively reduced the availability of services and amenities and housing anywhere within walking distance of each other. So again, zoning separates land uses and zoning requirements for parking and transportation planning requirements for the geometry of cars and interchanges take up so much space that it spreads us out across the landscape. And to the point where if you're going to have access to economic opportunities in the United States, if you're going to have access to church or the mosque or your friends or your relatives, if you want to be able to have a full life, to be a full participant in the economy and in society, you have to have a car. Sorry about that. The Dutch followed the American model in lockstep until the 1970s, when a group of architects in the Netherlands did a bunch of things like this. Here's a vivid architectural analysis that demonstrates the harmful formal, spatial, institutional arrangements of the automobile. Here's a traffic-choked street in Amsterdam in 1975. Here are the human bodies in their spatial relationship on that same street without the cars. You with me so far? Here are those same bodies in a bus, and here are those same bodies without the bus. It turns out that the space of the automobile itself, even when they're closely packed, as in this traffic jam, it's so wasteful that of course you end up with images like Houston, where 15% of the land is used for the things we're trying to get to, and 85% of the land is for parking and road infrastructure. And so here are those same bodies on bicycles, and there's how they fit into a bicycle lane. And here are those same bodies just walking down the street, and here's how they fit on the sidewalk. So between the image in the upper left and the image on the lower right, you actually free up 100% of the street space. A very powerful architectural demonstration of what it is we're talking about in terms of space. There's another phenomena that you need to put a pin in and come back to during your careers. It's called induced demand. The theory is, and it's not a theory, it was an observation, that every time we increase the capacity of a road, demand increases to meet it to the point where every time we expand the road infrastructure, we reproduce the same traffic jam. We have zero improvement of the traffic jam. We just shift our travel behaviors to fill up that added capacity. It seems like every generation discovers this as if for the first time. Who expected that? We just spent $10 million on adding one lane to the road, and we have the same traffic jams after suffering through 3 years of road construction. Wow, maybe we should add another lane? How many lanes do you add in order to alleviate the traffic? Well, it turns out you can add as many lanes as you want. The traffic jam will return, and it will make every other location more jammed. It will spread the traffic jam. It's not new. The first freeway, the first limited access road built in the United States, one of the first in the world, was between Los Angeles and Pasadena. And within 6 months of opening it, they had traffic jams. And that's when the traffic engineers first articulated this idea of induced demand. Why is it that we continuously make the same mistakes generation after generation? And this is the outcome. The logic of the United States urban transportation planning formulation is when you have traffic jams, add more lanes. When you have not enough parking, add more parking. Repeat. And this is the logical outcome that has transformed cities across the United States, where you get 15% of the land use in the buildings, 85% of the land area is for parking and roads. This is now spreading all around the world, and it's one of the things that is available for us to look at in our analysis work. And it is a cultural construct that impacts the way we design houses. These are snout houses where we put the garage out and we receive the entry in, that basically all but eliminates the social interaction, the chance encounters that might happen on the streets. Here's John Travolta's house. We can't wait for our flying cars, so there are now suburbs that are, for all intents and purposes, airport versions of suburbia. We land our private jets, we taxi and park it next to our house, and then we go inside. What is the ratio between the space of the living room and the space of the driveway and the cul-de-sac on John Travolta's house? So the sharpest critique is coming from Richard Rothstein, the whole topic that we discussed last week, and Jane Jacobs. Jane Jacobs wrote the book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, probably the single most important book to be written in the 20th century about cities, maybe Image of the City by Lynch, Kevin Lynch is up there. But Jane Jacobs, a mild-mannered housewife, is how she was belittled and dismissed for years by people like Robert Moses. She took on Robert Moses and she kicked his butt. And even though architects celebrate Jane Jacobs, this is a book by a good friend of mine. When he asked me, should I write a book on Jane Jacobs? I said, nah, she's been written about. Well, he wrote it anyway, and it was a huge success. So that was embarrassing for me. But we continue in our reviews yesterday with the thesis group. We talk about Jane Jacobs sections. This is a Jane Jacobs section. It's a section through a street, through the sidewalk, through the public space, and it cuts through. This is not quite a good Jane Jacobs section. I need a better image. But it goes into the interior spaces of the houses, because the relationship between these private residential interiors, the retail stores on the ground floor, on the street, are part of what produces a high quality built environment. So the Jane Jacobs section is a crucial, critical lens for understanding how we effectively critique automobile dependency. And we saw this, I think I showed this last summer, but the gated community that produced the horrible events of 2012 and 2020, when Trayvon Martin was murdered, um, Ahmaud Arbery was murdered in these suburban automobile dependent physical environments. Here we have a diagram that indicates the social connections on a street with heavy traffic, very few social connections, relative to the streets that have less traffic. Let's look at Boston through these lenses. There's the redlining map of Boston. There is the current racial segregation outcomes of Boston, and the two overlaid over each other. And what is the role of automobile dependency in all of this?
Thank you, Robert. Well, very interesting topic and gives the opportunity to develop many ideas. But I would like to continue with this dependency on the automobile, and the planning of the city has taken many roads, including the what happened in Boston with the investment of the big dig to lower down to undercut the land in order to put the highway underneath the park. So that all started, and I wanted just to take it, okay, to take it from the beginning. That all started at the late 19th century, when Boston was the second, well, actually the first city in all Americas, including the United States, North and South America, but the first city to develop a subway system. And after New York, I'm sorry, before New York, after London in Europe was the only example. And that moment, the subway system was not, well, actually, among the stations that we see here, the first subway was between Pleasant Street and Scholar Square and Adams Square. These three stations represent the beginning of the subway system in the United States. And the purpose was more than transportation, more than taking people to the downtown area, because it was very close, very short, was to in some way abandon, let's take the next one, abandon the heavy presence of people in the street. There was no way to cross that area without interference of many ways, the cable cars or the trams or the other people walking in the downtown area. So that transformed the opportunity to give the subway system a hand and push towards a new development. So please next. I don't have access to. So this was the impact area, the influence of the subway system, the first subway system that happened to be the Green Line in the center of the city between Scholar Square and, in this case, the Tremont Street. Okay, next. The construction of the subway gave certainly the dimension to a city of elements that were not thought like to be. So the city bidimensional aspect of a map changed completely with another world underneath. And the construction of that world gave the opportunity to develop certain ideas about cities in the sense of, in this case, Park Street represents the park. And these are views of the construction of that system that at the end also transformed the surface of the city, because they ended transforming the surface of the city into an area of separation and segregation, as Robert just mentioned. Next. So looking at the way the subway stations look like Park Street, for example, showing the different connections and the different dimensions that this station had. Next, as the more important one here, and also the beginning of the construction of tunnels. The one on the top under the Beacon Hill area for the Park Street connection to the Red Line into Cambridge, and the second tunnel under the lower one under the harbor to connect the East Boston with the airport to the central area of Boston. Next. And well, this is the way the system looks today. The Boston is a city that centralized all the activities in the downtown crossing area and expands in 4 directions, following the different needs of the population. And every circumstance makes you go to the center, to the downtown crossing, and from the center go back towards any of the areas that you need to go and you need to take. Another one, the most recent one, is the Orange Line. The Orange Line being changed from being a surface and also a high elevated subway lane in the area of Washington Street. This is Washington Street where the cathedral is located, into what it was a clean road, and the subway went underneath in the case of the Orange Line. And this is the Orange Line when it moved in 1987 from the surface, from the upper elevated rail of the Orange Line into the ground, underground, and liberated one of the interesting aspects, one of the interesting thoughts of the future of the city of Boston, which was the Southwest Corridor. Southwest Corridor, I'm sorry. The Southwest Corridor was the opportunity that the city had to implement the development of open space and landscape architecture, landscape spaces in the areas that were covered by the cover that covered the Orange Line. And there were some very good experiments within this line of open space and also of architecture made out of in the stations, like the Back Bay Station, for example, designed by Kalman, McKinnon, and Woods, the same group of architects who did the government center and the city hall, and they developed this station which with the simplicity of a canal, of a lane, of a passage within 2 blocks, so facades to both blocks, and this passage besides the passage, the passage, you have the underground, and also you have the railroad system going to the commuter rail system going further away to even to New York City, going through this Back Bay Station. I bring these pictures to show you the quality of the work in wood, the lightness of the work, the importance of natural light in the space, and the simplicity of the structure, and the beauty of a simple structure of ribs that creates that space very nicely. And the presence of offices also, depending on this exhaustion ducts for exhaustion of the station, and some offices around related to the transportation system. Next. So this vision, this brings us to the new vision of 2024, where we have the extension of some of the existing lines like the Green Line towards Somerville, being extended now, and the extension of the airport lanes or roads, so even beyond the airport in this area with the Silver Line, and the continuity of some of the commuter rail or the light, the rail beyond the center that transform the area into the commuter rails along the city. So this graphic accompanies the fact that what Robert, no, yes, let's change to the next one, to the highway system that anyway affected the area of Boston, but also affect the whole United States. It's part of a plan. The next one, this is the part of a plan designed by the administration of Dwight Eisenhower, is the interstate highway system. This is in parallel. This is what Robert was mentioning about the existence of a system that was meant to be the way to penetrate the territory in case of an invasion for defense reasons, and also became a need for the cities to be connected in a certain way, like a grid throughout the United States. And this is what the role of Eisenhower in this enterprise was key. The fact is that this system tends to connect the principal cities with a grid of connections that graphically you can see it like this, but in reality it's like, next please. Okay, in reality the intensity, it looks more like that. This represents the density of the use of each of the highways, of the roads, of the highways that transform the highway system into a car connection for the whole United States, with a heavy intensity in the northeast and some intensity in the east, in the east, southwest of the continent, of the country. Okay, and then one example of this that goes beyond the functional aspect of the highway, which is the cultural aspect of the highway. The cultural aspect of the property of the car and the relationship between the suburban American and the car is the Route 66, which has been the origin of many music, cultural, and some kind of a very unique type of American way of life along this axis that communicates Chicago from Los Angeles. Next. Now, in the case of Boston again, the system of I would say the highway system affected when it reaches the center of the city, because the whole idea was to reach the center of the cities in order to make it accessible for the workers of the suburbs living in the suburbs. So Boston had to create this ring, this sequence of rings that starts with 495, then the rings along closer to, when they get closer to the downtown area, from 93, coming from the north south, going through the center of the city and becoming that into the Big Dig, and the Route 90 in the other direction, coming from the west into the harbor to the airport. So this system of rings that join the center, follows the same scheme that we saw in the subway system, which is the scheme of the center of the city that allows you to come to the center of the city and live through other of the branches of this circular radial, semi-radial system that is cut only by the harbor. So you have the different rings, and the different rings connected into the center needed another part of the design, was stopped by the community. Let me have the next one. So this is the same way, looking at the same thing with different maps and the different connections that they make. Next, okay. And here you can see the intensity of this crossing that happens downtown in the center of Boston, underground in the case of the Thomas O'Neill Highway, which is the part that goes underneath the Big Dig. Next. So that reflects the effect that this picture shows, the effect, the continuity of the life of the city, how they used to be before the intervention of the Big Dig, and also before the intervention of the urban renewal and the demolition of big areas of the center of the city to create the housing and create new building and new services for the government. Next. So you can see by comparison, after the intervention of the Route 93 elevated highway in the north end, separating and breaking the connections between the north end and the west end in this part, and the whole downtown and financial district. Next. So this is the impact of the demolition that it had when it was built, and not too many years later was demolished too, because it demonstrated the inefficiency, completely inefficiency. So you can see the process of the same angle of the construction of the Route 93 in the central artery when it was demolished later. Next. Okay, this is still when it was built, and the construction of the different ramps that connected with and separated the separation of the city in that area in order to leave the penetration of the automobile into the center of the city. Next. Okay, some views of the impact of the construction of that artery. Next. Next. And finally, just to show you the outside the city, so the whole impact that these routes have in the center of the city. As soon as they get out of the city, they come back to the system in order to create the opportunities for the harbor to develop. And this is the Tobin Bridge. Next. And the continuation of the 93 into the suburbs, completely in the suburbs, is possible because of the continuity into the city and from north to south in the case of 93, which is this is the view from the south and the type of impact that it has after. This is the South Bay area where market, big shopping mall, and an opportunity for future developments as well. Next. So next. The weight of those structures, like the same Tobin Bridge we saw before. Okay, next. Okay, the final project that was not built, fortunately, but would be probably has to be rethought in terms of the pedestrian impact of a ring that would be the urban ring now, but at this time when it was planned, it was the inner belt. It was the shortest belt that extended that continuity of these belts into the center of the city. And this was a project that fortunately was stopped by the communities, the different communities that were affected in this area. Next. So this implied, if you see the center, the impact in the center of the city, this implied the Fenway area where you see it here. This also implies Cambridge and Somerville in a very close relation to the center, creating the last of the rings that was never built. Next. And here, just the detail of the the same access, the access to the ring that was projected for the areas close to Wentworth. And I just wanted to bring this to show you the location of this is Wentworth, and this is the Museum of Fine Art in blue here, and the impact that this would have had. This is what is now Northeastern University, and the impact that it would have had, and this was stopped by the participation of the communities in Massachusetts. Next. So here you have the governor, Sergeant, speaking trying to convince the community about the inner belt in 1969, and it was stopped by the community who stood by and defended the possibility of keeping the cars out of the city, the center of the city. Next. And this, I think this is the last view of this entrance. This is the housing, Alice Taylor housing. This is the Prudential area, and this is the impact that we would have had the highway in the northeastern area of very close to Wentworth.
Yeah, so this is the Alice Hayward Taylor houses that are. This is basically in the center of this view is Ruggles Station. Now,
exactly.
Yeah, in Northeastern. You see the Museum of Fine Arts in the back.
Right. Okay.
And so here's what that looks like. Let's see if this works. This is an interesting. This is what it looks like today with Rose Kennedy Greenway. This is what it looked like before the freeway. There really needs to be three views in this. There needs to be this view, then the freeway cutting through, and then the restoration of Rose Kennedy Greenway. But one thing to look at as we do this is the impact of urban renewal. This whole area here, which is, what do we call that? The north end, the west end. So the west end was one of the most famously devastated communities of recent immigrants who were not able to advocate for themselves. They were displaced. This entire neighborhood was bulldozed, and the West End was built, and an entirely new community came into its place. And so Boston is very much both the product of and the instrument for the continuous transformation of the built environment under the impact of these multiple converging forces of automobile dependency and racism. And just to circle back to 2 weeks ago when we talked about the American dream overseas, there was a very strong element that we mentioned then that had to do with the role of the automobile, the private vehicle ownership, how that lies at the core of the American dream and at the core of what is inherited overseas. John Uri in the reading made the comment that it's almost as if the greater the poverty in a place, the more pull, the more attraction that automobile ownership has for the society involved. This, unfortunately, on the left is back in 1995, but it's interesting to see that China had an automobile ownership rate of 5 per 1,000 people, which corresponds with the ownership rate in the United States in 1910. By 1995, the United States had an automobile ownership rate that was close to 800 cars per 1,000 people. And at the time, these are the locations of all the other countries. The most dramatic one is China, down at 5 cars per 1,000 people. Fast forward to today, China is quickly becoming the greatest exporter of automobiles in the world, soon to surpass the United States. And automobile ownership in China is skyrocketing at the same time. The ring roads of the world is a dramatic demonstration of how this idea of American car-based transportation planning has been imposed to a large extent by institutions like the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the American Development Bank. Uh, these development organizations travel the world peddling the idea that, hey, if you want to serve the needs of your community, of your citizens, you need to build them more freeways. And I saw this firsthand in my time in Indonesia, where the Japanese International Development Agency first went to Thailand, promoted, supported the construction of highways in Thailand, and Bangkok became the most traffic choked location in the world in the 90s. And it was so successful, the Japanese organization, they sold so many cars to the people of Thailand that they repeated that formula all over the Americas. This is very much at the heart of the story of Designing for Life in Colombia that we started the semester with. Famously, the mayor of Bogota, Colombia, ran on a platform saying to the Japanese, we'll take your development money, but we will not develop freeways. Instead, we will develop the best bus rapid transit system the world has ever seen, the most complete bicycle network the world has ever seen. And that was the transformation of Bogota, Colombia, that was very much at the heart of what then later happened in Medellin, Colombia, and is at the heart of the Designing for Life example that is the anchor point for what we as architects must do as we move into the 21st century. In contrast, India has engaged in a dramatic, aggressive interstate freeway construction system that is dividing people from their workplaces, dividing families, dividing villages, dividing farmland from where people live. And so you see these panicked scrambles. And then the most dramatic location where the road system idea that used to be very American, but now it has left home, it has left the United States, it has left home and taken on a life of its own. And it's out there running free in the rest of the world. This is the interstate highway system of Asia. Roads are being developed at a very aggressive rate across Asia. And currently, the most aggressive road building effort is being funded and promoted by China. It is called One Belt, One Road. It is we talked about the historic humiliation of China in the 19th century with the Boxer Rebellion, the Opium Wars, the ostensible submission of China to the European powers in places like Shanghai, and how important it is for Shanghai and China to assert itself on the global stage. Well, they are doing it, and they're doing it in reference to the pre-colonial history of the Silk Road. That is the road part of the One Belt, One Road initiative. China has become the biggest road infrastructure financier in the world, and Africa is one of the primary targets for Chinese investment, which will have a profound impact on everything. Global climate change, population trajectories, the state of women's rights in the world, everything. So what is an architect to do? Well, the short answer is do what they do in the Designing for Life. Go back to what we started the semester with. As was implied in the reading, we expect a a tipping point to occur. We don't know when, we don't know what combination of forces will drive it, but you recognized in that reading that was published in 2002 uh, a, a strange academic description of what we have lived through. Uber, the private driver revolution means we don't need to own cars anymore. When uh, your generation and the prior decade of people graduating from college, they are graduating and dramatically under purchasing cars. No one knows why, really, but it's happening. And who knows, maybe the pandemic will be a part of this. But car ownership is down. The annual miles traveled was down prior to the pandemic. And Zoom is another thing that is described in unfamiliar terms in the reading. Exactly the technical terms that they describe, we now know it as the Zoom revolution. Walkability is a new factor in determining the cost of real estate. The more walkable the neighborhood, the more expensive the real estate. So all of a sudden, real estate developers are promoting walkability because it's being driven by the bottom line economic incentive of development. Developers build parking at great expense, not because they want to, not because the market demands it, but because local municipalities require it by law. Town after town, and this is the world you are graduating into, town after town is taking their parking minimum rules and they're flipping them. They're doing the opposite. Instead of saying every development must have 1.5 parking spaces per unit of housing, Boston, Cambridge, or 2.1 parking spaces per unit of development, Brookline, or 2.5 or 3 parking spaces per unit. They're flipping that. Town after town is saying you are not allowed to develop more than 1 parking space per unit. And that is a dramatic change. The control of parking is one of the most powerful tools in our toolkit for reducing automobile dependency, and something that should belong in every architect's kit of parts, the tricks of the trade that we are expected to be masters of. We are being asked by clients to implement a complete streets strategy. When you talk to clients, when you present in your studio, do not call this a road. It is not a road. A road implies automobile only. Refer to it as a street. Streets are for people. Streets are for people in a wide variety of speeds and modes of transportation. Streets are outdoor rooms in the tradition of Jane Jacobs, and streets are architectural productions. They are for people. They are the living rooms that we use to negotiate our social relationships to the rest of the world. Someday, when the pandemic is over, we will flood back into the streets and we will have dance parties. And it will be a living room once again. We are expected to design these living rooms, not just for cars, not just for storing private vehicles in parking places, but for social interactions. Okay. Thank you, everyone. We will see you next Wednesday. Good luck with your analyses. If you want to stay after class and talk to us, please do so. In the meantime, thank you, everyone. See you soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Manuel.